I told Minister Johnson that Minister Dennis must be scraping the bottom of the barrel to ask Henry Darby to come here and say a few words. I'm the least of those. Sometimes I think it's like affirmative action with Liberty Hillian. Y'all decide just to help us out just because I'm from Liberty Hill. I cannot find the adequate words to say just yet, but it's good to be here. Reverend Williams, you've been on the battlefield for a very, very long time, sir. And we are indebted to you and your leadership. I see in the midst that we have Representative Whooper. One reason why I'm on County Council today is because of Representative Whooper. And then there's Representative Mack. Every word he said was true. I must say, so I did go to Dr. Richardson. And I let him know I wasn't pleased with that. Because I've never known you to give $2,000 a year. And of course, he put me in my place. Martin Luther King Jr. and strange inconsistencies. Some years ago, when the Congress of the United States was considering a civil rights bill, a young black man, not yet 30 years of age, spoke vigorously and eloquently in support of the bill. And speaking of the centuries of the mistreatment of black people in the United States, he said, if this unjust discrimination is to be longer tolerated by the American people, then I can only say with sorrow and regrets that our boasted civilization is a fraud, our Republican institution a failure, our social system a disgrace, and our religion a complete hypocrisy. The speaker was John R. Lynch, former Speaker of the Mississippi House of Representatives. He was urging his colleagues in 1875 to put an end to racial discrimination in public schools, on the railroads, and other places of public accommodation. Yeah. Congress passed the act, but 8 years later in 1883, the United States Supreme Court struck down the law and remarked that the law to protect the civil rights of all people was unconstitutional. For the African American, what sense of rejection, what sense of estrangement, what sense of a shameless hypocrisy and a revolting inconsistency for a nation to strike down equal treatment whereby its very creed postulates all men are created equal. Yeah. The decision was hailed throughout the land as fair and just. Only African Americans and a few whites deplored the decision. T. Thomas Fortune said that his fellow blacks felt as if they had been baptized in ice water. Thus began the 3rd century of racial injustice in the United States. Those early years from the 17th to the 19th centuries have been marked not merely by the barbarism of slavery, but also by the denial of equal rights even to those African Americans who were already free. Those early years had witnessed the struggle of white Americans to win their political independence from England, but the determination to deny even the rudiments of freedom to their African American compatriots who had fought side by side with them evinced a strange inconsistency. And when the United States found it necessary to fight to save its own life during the Civil War, it faltered time and time again on the fundamental questions of human freedom and the dignity of men. In 1863, in what is now known as the Emancipation Proclamation, the black man was freed from physical bondage, but the nation refused to give him any money or any land to make that freedom meaningful. Congress never heeded the cry of Frederick Douglass of 40 acres and a mule. But at the same time, America was giving away millions and millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest to its white peasants from Europe, but refused to give land to black peasants from Africa, although they had worked the land for free for 244 years. That's a strange inconsistency. And that's why Frederick Douglass was able to say that emancipation for the black man was freedom to hunger. It was freedom to the winds and rains of heaven. Freedom without roofs to cover their heads. It was freedom and famine without bread to eat, without land to cultivate. It was freedom and famine at the same time. That's a strange inconsistency. It was such an inconsistency that Frederick Douglass cried out, "It's a miracle that the black man has survived." After the Civil War, the inconsistency continues. A company of black Union soldiers who in 1865 told Andrew Johnson that it was strange that former Confederates returning from doing battle against the Union for 4 years were allowed to vote, while African American soldiers who had fought for the Union were denied the vote. A strange inconsistency. In 1896, United States Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, the court declared racial segregation constitutional, which brought about the doctrine of separate but equal. In substance, the Supreme Court reached back to 1857 to the Dred Scott decision, which unashamedly pronounced that, and I quote, "The Negro has no rights which the white man was bound to respect." These were strange inconsistencies in the land of the free and the home of the brave. In 1954, what is now known as Brown versus Board of Education, whereby segregation was declared legally dead, particularly in the area of education. It is somewhat esoteric, but the same Supreme Court sought to reverse itself by passing the pupil placement law, which allowed the Southern whites to maintain a segregated school system. And believe it or not, even in our own midst, the 1954 Supreme Court decision has not been implemented in all community areas of diversity. Burke High School, and to this day, is still one of the most thoroughly segregated schools within the nation. A strange inconsistency. Now comes the second half 20th century. Now comes Dr. King, a man who knew his history as well as his theology. He knew how far back race hatred went, how deeply it was embedded, how pervasive it was. If Patrick Henry could cry, "Give me liberty or give me death," when England imposed a stamp tax, surely King could protest the indignities heaped on his people by requiring them to enter a bus by a rear door. If Henry David Thoreau could denounce the Commonwealth of Massachusetts for enacting laws which interfere with his complete freedom, surely King could protest the failure of the federal government to protect would-be black voters from the dogs, the fire hoses, and bullwhips. If women could protest the many inequalities of the sexes, surely King could protest the racial discrimination in education, employment, housing, and voting. Dr. King would confront these inconsistencies and would give his entire life to wiping it out by means of nonviolent protest, to accept blows without retaliation, and to love his enemies by means of agape. For his efforts, twice his home was bombed. He was the victim of a near-fatal stabbing. He was placed in jail 29 times. He was threatened with death on an average of 40 times a day. He was denounced as communistic and was called the most notorious liar in the country. He was vilified in newspapers and magazines, castigated on television and radio. Even several civil rights leaders were envious of him. White preachers denounced him. Jewish rabbis condemned him, particularly when he protested in Birmingham, Alabama. You should read the letter from a Birmingham jail. Apostle Paul could not have penned a better letter. But in spite of the obstacles, King pressed forward, and he would not stop. He could not accept the violence and barbarity of his adversaries, who could bomb scores of churches where defenseless African Americans met to protest injustices, who could murder men and women whose only crime was their search for equality, who could murder little children whose only offense was to be in their places in Sunday school when the bomb exploded. Through it all, he was not daunted because his optimism was boundless, his faith unshakable, his love altruistic, his desire for peace endless, his hope for betterment enduring, in spite of the fact that racism was deeply embedded in the vital organs of American life. And what is racism? It is a faith, a form of idolatry, which says one group is eternally blessed to the status of superiority, while another group is eternally condemned to the status of inferiority. And the ultimate arrogance of racism is to say that God made a creative error. But King believed inconsistencies could be uprooted as the soul of America was at stake. One has to wonder how America could have retained its sanity or its soul with these inconsistencies. These inconsistencies sustained this country virtually going mad as it defended segregation, glorified discrimination, loved lynchings, and tolerated riots. It was a difficult task for Dr. King to always point out inconsistencies, pleading for an end to hypocrisy, calling on the nation to correct its own weaknesses. And from 1955 to 1968, it was the task of this young Martin Luther King Jr. to reach back through the vista of time and join hands